We're so excited to be here with you today. Thank you, Parking Reform Network, for both the warm welcome and intro, and letting us come talk through. As you guys heard in our bios, Eric and I have worked together a long time through the Incremental Development Alliance. And so while we certainly are going to be incremental everything, we also want to talk about what some of the really realistic downsides to incremental parking reform can be, right? We want to get what we can get done this year, and also we want to talk through that there can be some struggles with that. And Eric, I don't know if you want to hop in at all. I know we're really a collaborative set of presenters, and so we'll be kind of hopping back and forth as we go. But I know Eric's going to have a lot of thoughts to share on this kind of intro as well.
Yeah, I think let's go to the next slide, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. But I think part of IncCodes is Allie, myself, and Elizabeth Ward-Williams from our office. Like a lot of things Allie and I both do is born from frustration, in that so often we at Incremental Development Alliance we'll go to a city, we'll talk about all the wonderful things that small developers could do to help make their city better, and it's all illegal, right? And the city may want to let things happen. They may want to legalize things, but they just don't know how to go about it. And so IncCodes was founded as a way to offer really bite-sized code reform across scales that can meet smaller and mid-sized towns where they are, to try to move the needle forward. And I think let's pop next slide, if I remember right. Yeah, so the whole discussion we want to have today with everybody is cold turkey or methadone. Like, that's what all this is about. And essentially, we firmly believe that parking requirements are a cancer on society, and it prevents having inclusive places, having great places, but it's hard to get to a better outcome. Ripping the Band-Aid off, going cold turkey, eliminating parking requirements is an amazing way to go about it. But just like quitting heroin, it's really, really hard. And it's a really great way to get fired if you're a public official or a staff member. So we want to talk about methadone as a strategy for harm reduction. And we're not here to advocate that being on methadone is like healthy or good as a long-term solution, but it beats being on heroin. So that's the premise of today. And I'll let you take this and talk more about the IncCodes components.
And for a little bit of background of what we've been trying to do, as Eric said, we often ended up in communities saying, great, here are all the wonderful things that you can do to rebuild your place as soon as you make these zoning reforms. And then left them sort of with no solutions. And so we've got a really great developing national set of solutions to zoning reform, which also struggles with, as parking reform does. Do we do a wholesale replacement? Do we try to patch the, system that we're working with right now? And so we've written a model code that is intended to come in and replace either it can be adopted incrementally, or it can be adopted wholesale for communities. Often we say, 5,000 to 75,000 people, kind of that mid-sized town that a lot of America really is working through. One of the pros of zoning reform is that usually 7 people in your town that and you could go knock on their door are in charge of your zoning code. For some of our crew in New York City, maybe don't go knock on their door. They might feel differently about that than they would here in Fayetteville, Arkansas. But this is a really local control issue. So the pro of that is you can make incredible change in a relatively short period of time in your town, if you can rally enough support. Often too, if we look at the voting rates in your local elections that are electing those, 5 to 7 officials who have full control over what your zoning is, it's often a very small sliver of your town. It is not a large lift to get the right number of people who will vote to get this done. That's the pro, right? I want to set us up with feeling like we have a lot of local control over this. The con is this is something that we then have to do 10,000 times across the United States, because we have to convince each one of those communities, often individually, to do this work. So as the Incremental Development Alliance, that's one of the things that we have struggled with, is that there is no way to do this we've seen some state reforms. Those are making really good progress. Even if we get to a state reform level, we need to do this 50 times. And often this is really community by community. And so creating some model solutions that are really easy to adopt, that's an easy lift, is part of where we started here, that IncCodes has modules that can be adopted, right? They're really patches, right? So we need to patch our ADU system. Here's the code module you can adopt for that. We need to patch our parking reform network. Here's the module that you can take and read at your city council meeting, and they can approve to modify that. One of the things that we internally really struggled with, though, is we have a couple of variations of the parking one, because our recommendation almost always is just eliminate your parking requirements. That is the thing that you should do, and you don't need to pay us any money to do that. And so many communities struggle to take that step. I think there are times that it feels politically challenging. I think there also are communities that have not developed that culture of modifying their code. One of the things that I have really, I think, brought to our team is I'm in a community that we modify our ordinances and our unified development code in sections almost, every meeting. There is some little tweak that's happening. And so because we're in a community that has that ethos and that habit, it doesn't feel like a huge change to make small pilot changes and tweaks. There are a lot of communities that less than once a year are making any kind of changes to their unified development code. So from an incremental approach, also one of my recommendations to communities is always start a long range code reform committee, call it something really neutral. One of the things that's really challenging about a lot of our unified development codes, which is often where your parking standards sit legally within your town, is that this is not my phrase, I stole this from somebody, but we only rate those with one side of the pencil, right? So we're constantly adding new sections. We're very rarely going in and cleaning up or deleting. And so often you can start to build that culture of reform unrelated to parking in a way that will eventually be really useful to parking by starting to develop this culture of modifying and cleaning up and improving your unified development code. So you can start that with modifications and improvements that are take every variant asked town and granted. Most towns have a couple of codes that everybody asks for a variance for it. It's always granted. You can, with the justification of lessening administrative burden and reducing city staff time, start to go in and tackle those first. Tackle lots of things that are really easy, that are not contentious, right? Clean up language that conflicts between sections. Get nerdy with a committee that is sitting and reading your code and saying, here are the things that need to be modified. We're bringing you this set of changes. As you start to develop that kind of incremental culture, you can then really get into the more meaty, how are we addressing parking reform? Because really your density and your tax basis of your town are functionally capped by your parking reform. So it is one of the most important things to work through. Eric, I'm going to pass back to you to kind of talk through the increments of development that you can begin to talk about and really unlock as you reduce your parking minimums.
Yeah, and so we'll do a little bit of background on IncCodes or Incremental Development Alliance, IncDev, for this. Is that these are a couple of foundational slides from the great Mike Thompson. Looking at the increments of development and allowing the moving from food trucks and pop-up markets to trailers to all these different levels of buildings is super helpful, and parking requirements can get in the way of every one of these. And so in incremental development, we're talking about helping get these increments moving up the food chain of both small scale commercial and residential as well. And the biggest barrier to accessible, attainable housing is always going to be parking requirements. Zoning's in the way, but even if you allow duplexes or multiplexes or townhomes, all too often it's parking that's killing the outcomes and possibilities for that. So let's pop next. And one of the things that we also like to really talk about is when we're looking at these incremental code reforms, we've been running numbers and teaching the basic math of small development for a decade now with IncDev, and the math really matters, right? And if you want housing at the rents that are appropriate for your community, policies have got to shift. And so we're grounding our designs, we're grounding our policies in a mutually reinforcing approach to get to better outcomes, right? So one of, I think, both Alli and my biggest complaints is when we deal with policy, is that the policymakers can't do the math, right? They don't understand what a perform is, they don't understand development, they don't understand the barriers, so it's really hard. And so what we like to talk about, though, is, a lot of us, probably everyone on this call, is really passionate about educating to try to change policy. But most people think it's like, well, you educate and then you policy change and then maybe do a pilot. We don't think that's the right path, because you can educate a lot. A lot of these issues don't really land or stick. the dots sometimes can be hard to connect for folks, and externalities can be hard. So if you go educate and try to change policy, that can be really scary. The policy can get watered down, and you might get fired. So let's pop to the next slide. And again, the fundamental question is, if you're a city staffer, is how do you get past that education phase and keep your job? And so we've been talking for quite a while and working with cities across the state of Georgia that we want to educate and we want to lead with a pilot to demonstrate the policy, because people are a lot less scared based on positive outcomes. Policy is like a Pandora's box of everything that could go wrong in society. But if you show them a concrete example of how to do this, you can get more done. And we'll talk a little bit about the Atlanta examples later on in the conversation. But taking that step process, when we think about pilot zoning, what we really drill down to and distill down to in IncCodes is 4 different modules. And so if we pop over, we have both a planned unit development or a PUD and or a floating zone. It really works the same way. That's getting yourself a good district that you can actually allow reasonable things to happen. You don't have to map it anywhere, but you can, dole it out as appropriate for your city. And we're doing that in multiple cities right now. The parking reform we'll definitely talk about today and how that can be implemented. ADUs are easy to understand, I think, over this group. One of the other things that we've seen a lot is policymakers are just really scared that really nasty, ugly stuff is going to get built. And how do you deal with that? And so we spent a lot of time thinking about, I'd call them medium touch form controls, architecture form controls, where we're trying to balance the least amount you need to require to get a reasonable outcome and not to be overly burdensome to implement or require. So some minimums, things with porches and stoops, some windows, get parking behind the building. How do you right size that and not bloat it, right? And so all of these are about trying to allow as much good while trying to understand that you don't want to leave the door wide open, because that's just scary for policymakers. So it's always a trade-off game and a balancing act game. And so next slide. Today, we're going to be talking about the parking specifically and the ins and outs, and we'll talk some high-level things with all this. And fundamentally, one of the things we've seen, and Alli, you should definitely add to this, is that Alli and I presented on zoning reforms and seen for years with cities. And what we found is you can tell city staffers these are all the things they could do. And if they're ready for it, they'll probably nod their heads and say, yeah, we know. But we've got like 2 or 3 or 4 staff people doing the work of 10. Nobody has time to try to figure out how to write a parking module or a form control module or any of these things on the screen. And so IncCodes is there to make it easy, hit an easy button and provide a ready to go ordinance for all of these things. So I don't even remember what's next, Alex. I'll let you take, oh yeah. It's harm reduction. Methadone is harm reduction. Cold turkey is harm reduction. It's all harm reduction. And that's the lens, but we also want to have a conversation with Tony and Daniel after this to talk about, we all want harm reduction, but what is the right strategy and approach for your town? And how do you get clean, right? That is the ultimate goal. We like to say cold turkey's free. Like, we're not, just take it, just get rid of your parking requirements. Like, that's what PRN is about. Go do it. But methadone in the real world, and here it costs money to do this kind of to help you through the process. So if you don't need us and you can go cold turkey, man, that is awesome. But if you need some help, we're happy to keep talking about it.
Part of the methadone approach too, right, is that we also want you to think about it as a plan, right? That it is not about, okay, we're incrementally not going to fully reform our parking. We really want you to be thinking about parking reform. If you can't go to cold turkey, as what is the plan? What is the timeline? What are the steps, right? What are our dosages that we're going to be dialing down as we work through this? Because as we start to, the eventual goal is reduction or elimination of parking minimums completely. Most of the most desirable parts of your town, of any town, were built without any parking requirements and often without any parking. And so we also want to be very transparent that our goal is not maintaining, better parking charts, maintaining different parking minimums. The methadone approach, right, and having intermediary steps, the goal is still the same. The goal is still getting to no parking minimums within your town, which does not mean no one will build parking within your town. It means that everyone can decide what the right amount of parking that they need for their business is, within their own situation. And that can change through time, but it also begins to eliminate parking as this sort of free good that is required to be provided. So there are several kind of modules of what that dial down plan is, right? And approaches of part of the other politics of this, right, too, is there are times that in some towns it is easier for communities to pass something that they didn't write in-house, which can leave a planner within the department feeling like they're on the hook for the success of it. So there also is a part of this that is us saying, let us be both the out-of-town expert, and also the bad guy. If it, if you have pushback, great. You have somebody who doesn't live there that can also be, help keep you from getting fired.
And
so the range of solutions here really is those additive reductions that slowly reduce less parking tied to usages. We also want to say parking needs to be located in the right places for the right uses. And so there are some strategies of, are we reducing parking first for commercial? Are we reducing parking first for residential? Which is the bigger problem in town? Does splitting those apart work better? Where I am in Fayetteville, commercial parking requirements were eliminated completely first. Residential parking was seen as too contentious, but commercial parking, people saw business owners as having a more direct need to have the right amount of parking. And so we were able to sort of pilot in eliminating commercial parking requirements first. And now only, 5 years later, starting to slowly dial down residential parking. And so I can both speak
that
to
really quick, Alli, I want to add a little bit to it. One of the things I want to stress from an additive approach, and this is something that's been pretty successful in Atlanta, is Atlanta passed a range of reductions, and this is how we're approaching our module, in that things such as on-street parking are allowed to count towards off-street. That shouldn't be that controversial, but we also now don't require parking for buildings built before 1965 as a historic preservation strategy. That's really helpful. If you don't have transit proximity doesn't really get you there, but just those two components matter. And so you can have a transit or bus stop proximity component. But what we see is that we are able to reduce parking through using a couple of the different credits, right? Older building, that is parking free. We can build a new building on the site. We only have to provide parking for that. And we can use on-street to offset some of that. So it's a range of harm reduction strategies, and none of the individual line items feel that crazy to people. But what happens is if you're in an older part of town, we like to say, we'll show in a minute, like before 1929, your better platted gridded streets probably have more on-street parking anyways, probably are closer to core city, probably more walkable. There's a range of assumptions that go into that. These are places where doing less parking, leveraging on-street parking, all are less impactful and should be less scary than in the suburban sprawl edges of your town.
And in neighborhoods where on-street parking is already more common, we also see that as being more culturally acceptable. There are a lot of suburban settings where having someone parked on the street outside of your house is seen as a kind of lower quality neighborhood. There is a brand of NIMBYs that is also very against on-street parking. And so part of the incremental approach is great. Don't start in those neighborhoods, but in neighborhoods that parallel parking on street is already a part of the fabric and the usage, just allowing on-street parking within a certain block radius of the units or of the business to count towards your parking required counts can be one of the simplest, most incremental elements. That also can be really easily justified from both a pedestrian safety standpoint, because if your streets are too wide, which a lot of neighborhood streets are, adding on-street parking can narrow those even in a way that is compliant with the fire code, that is zero cost for your town. You can get slower traffic, safer speeds, and you can also have significant reductions of stormwater runoff because you're eliminating additional impervious area by utilizing impervious area that the city is already operating. We've seen some parking districts, some sticker kind of programs come out of those in some communities too, that can't even be revenue generating for the city, that you need to buy a parking pass as a resident to be on street, but that can be run in the city and generate revenue again with a resource the city already has, is already maintaining, which is paved street right of way. That if it's underutilized can be even a revenue generation element for your town. So there's lots of these other sort of ancillary justifications for these kinds of parking reforms that in communities that are struggling with making progress can be great to build the components and the contingent around these kinds of reforms by bringing in all of these, side benefits that we know to be true.
And then the one thing I'll add, just again, an Atlanta example is for a lot of the projects we design, we're leveraging on-street parking on a regular basis, and we're often relocating the curb inboard 2 to 4 feet or 5 feet on streets that don't have on-street parking, because that is still the most cost-effective way to park a handful of vehicles. So we're providing a public benefit because we don't control those parking spaces. They are public, but it's still in our interest to provide those to make a project viable. And the other thing we can talk about with this is, how you lay that. You can calibrate this in a range of ways. You can pick a series of reductions that can be applied citywide, but often cities have specific overlays anyways, or specific districts. We like our parking module to be a standalone component of your zoning ordinance, so you could reference which districts get to leverage section 302.5.4 for your parking reduction, so you can be more calibrated in how you pick and choose where this goes. And the other thing we present a lot on KUA's side is our methodology of where the places that are really useful to focus on is we picked 1929 as the development pattern line for where your city probably was doing good urbanism. And basically the point is, after the Black Monday, the great crash in October of 29, we stopped really building cities because we were broke and the Depression happened, and it was then post-World War II. But what we also really like is it's relatively easy-ish to find Sanborn maps from your city from the 20s and early 20s to the late 20s. So I think Sanborn really struggled after the Depression. So we say, find your Sanborn map, look at the areas that they were mapping from an insurance standpoint. This is Asheville, North Carolina, just for reference. These are the neighborhoods where you should be able to do this most easily. We do this because it's a cheat code for folks that aren't doing urbanism every day and are trying to figure out where are the boundaries that make sense. This may or may not align perfectly with your zoning districts, but this is just a good back of napkin. Where should you start thinking about for your place? And one of the things for Shapistas on the call, we all know that existing parking ratios are pseudoscience on the best of days. And it's like trying to debate with some politicians or wrestle pigs in mud. Debating what the ratios should be we just don't see that as a winning game. So we don't want to fight over your chart. We would like to get rid of your chart or give you a set of reductions, that methadone, just to eliminate the pain of your chart, right? That's what this is about. So again, like I was saying earlier, we can talk about this stuff. We can give you slides of all these ideas you could do in your town. But more and more, we just want to sell a low-cost ordinance to cities that make it really easy to adopt, right? Selling you a stock zoning ordinance is not a high-cost effort for us. Helping you train, calibrate, educate, that's more time and effort. But we want to know that there's an easy button for your city, right? That's why IncCodes exists. But again, we're ready. If you're ready for methadone, we're here for you. And I think that's it. Let's go to Tony or Daniel. We'd love. I know some people. We had a great conversation. We talked about this, 4 or 5 months ago. We were planning, and there's a lot of reasonable hand wringing that is like methadone just an excuse not to get clean, right? And I think a lot of people in the chat are worried about incremental slowing down or delaying better reforms. And so I think that's just a trade-off conversation we'd love to have with you, and or questions from the chat. To talk about this, because we hear activists that want to get to zero parking. We do too. This is all about how we get there.
Well, thanks a lot. Great presentation. And a good amount to think about. I guess one question is, at what size of a city do you think? And you mentioned a couple things, sizes of cities and the age, right? So if you've got a city that, for example, was mostly built after 1929, or is built, is in the West, right? Most of our cities out here in the West aren't that old, or a certain size. Where do you think, what's the applicability point here, to a larger city or a newer city? Is there really a sweet spot where you don't think this type of methadone applies?
I'll start to give you like, so some of the biases we have is most of our work is east of the Mississippi, right? And so most cities east of the Mississippi have some core part of their town probably built before 29. And the West is a very different animal, right? But even in the West, there's a lot of cities that have that core downtown, but there's also a lot of cities that are full on newer, right? Post that time. So that's what we're used to. That's what we see. That's what we react to. But what we really see pain points in Georgia is the cities of 5,000 to 50,000 in particular, where they're smaller towns, but they have a full-on urban condition, right? They've got that Main Street, they've got the center square with courthouse, they've got these things that make for great urbanism, but they're a small town. So they may think they're rural, but they have an urban component and they don't have codes at all that are calibrated to that. And more, we're seeing towns have really thriving downtowns, right? These are more attainable places to live. They're getting restaurants and coffee shops, but they're hitting up against all kinds of problems, right? From their old suburban-based development codes. So that's the lens that we see the most. Alli, you take it. And that's not that that's the only places, but that's our 80% solution for what we see in Georgia.
I think it's also so west of the Mississippi, kid, right? That I'm not half of our organization. What we are really promoting here too is these are the places that overlay districts are going to be the most immediately successful in tackling parking reform, because you're part of the way there already. You already have a good base fabric. These are places that were designed to work without a lot of parking. And so eliminating parking requirements within those areas is likely to be most immediately successful because it's not a necessary part of the pattern. And so it's the easiest place to start is really what we're saying. And that almost every town that had any sort of pattern, even before World War II, has some component of traditional pattern downtowns, walkable neighborhood districts, even very small towns that we work in, usually have a little bit of remaining fabric. And so those are the places that you can often pilot parking reductions. Again, using some of these ancillary benefits, using historic preservation as your baseline. We see a lot of towns where buildings get torn down to provide parking that complies with the parking requirements in the town. And so in those historic parts of town is the most critical place to reduce parking, but it's also the place that's going to be most immediately successful. And you want your pilots to be successful so you can expand them. That's part of that scale down approach. And so there are places, right, suburban Phoenix, where just eliminating parking requirements isn't going to move the needle a lot on the problems that we're seeing. Not that we don't think you should do it. It's just not going to be your most successful first pilot because there's so many other problems you also need to fix at the same time. And so a lot of this is also saying in these historic parts of town, right, in your urban core, you can eliminate parking requirements right away and often have only positive effects. Some of the things that we've seen happen as that happens, as we see these communities that can reduce or eliminate parking requirements, we see businesses go back into buildings that have been empty only because there's no way to open a business in the building without having parking, without tearing down the building next door to put in a parking lot. Often in communities that don't actually have a parking problem. And so we often see only immediate and positive impacts from eliminating your parking requirements first in these kind of overlay districts in these historic areas. Not that that's the only place you can do anything, but that's where you should start if you have one. And then understand that as you expand out from that area, which is the next step that needs to happen, which should be happening on a timeline plan. If you're in a community that has no historic core whatsoever, you really then need to be thinking of parking reform as a larger package of changes in order to have it feel successful, because the goal is that you're making changes that people like, that people immediately see positive benefits from to their life. A restaurant gets opened in an empty building that they like to go to dinner in, right? Their kid gets a job in a location that wouldn't otherwise have been open. You want to create positive benefits within that small percentage of voters that are going to be voting for your elected officials so that you can then take the next steps down the line.
So I want to actually, Grace made a comment that I want to respond to, and I want to be really calibrated. And the larger the development you're hoping to do, the more conventional financing you're going to need, the more lenders and the system wants to see parking to guarantee financial success. That's not a universal thing, but it's a generally true thing, right? Not all banks are that way, but banks are a lot more flexible on smaller projects than they are on bigger ones. So if you're hoping that parking reform is going to unlock large scale development, often the practicalities of just development math and finance will really reduce the benefits. Now, that's not to say, again, just like Alli said, that doesn't make this good, but where we see the biggest impact in parking reform is an incremental development, allowing 4 units of housing on a lot, allowing the existing buildings to go back into service that were vacant, allowing a small downtown that was never built with parking to be legalized again to be reused. So thinking that you're going to get $100,000 or $200,000 square foot development because parking's been reduced, that development's still going to need to have to pay for a deck or a lot of surface parking or something due to the economics of the American system. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's what we see is the requirement in all but the most urban of areas.
So one question I had, and I don't know if maybe you haven't worked I know that our parking mandates map shows one thing was kind of a surprise as Sam Dietz, our super volunteer, went and has added 3,000 whatever records to this map is how many places, particularly in the Midwest and, like already have no parking mandates in these downtown or Main Street areas. Like, in fact, I did a little bit of research on this and, around in the 40s, a lot of places, their strategy was, okay, we're going to create like a little parking district authority downtown. We're going to assemble a little land to build a parking lot and eventually a garage. We're going to exempt that area from parking mandates. But then everything else, from here on out, you got to build your parking stuff. And it's interesting once you see that, then you see that, that's where like one of my biases towards, hey, you got to, end all mandates citywide, all uses is, really that, I feel like there's so much pressure from the other car centric stuff that's being built around there that prevents that redevelopment or prevents like you can't really utilize that. Like these places stay parking heavy because everything else around it is. So have you worked with cities that already had exemptions or zones downtown, and how do you fix them?
Oh man, so like the problem with downtowns, and I'm saying like let's say a town of 50 to 75,000 people or 30 to 75,000 people, they have a downtown and it's not really humming. It's not humming because not enough people are down there. And if you want a downtown to hum, you need people living near downtown where it's easier to walk and bike downtown than to drive and try to find a parking spot. So what we tend to see all the time is there's this edge condition of like the 3 to 6 blocks around that downtown core, that Main Street core, that is kind of, it has more traditional missing middle. It may have some light industrial. It has, maybe some fine grain fabric, maybe not, but it's kind of this weird stuff where maybe it's neighborhood, maybe it's not neighborhood, but that's where you need to allow more intense missing middle housing. And the thing that holds back more intense missing middle housing to support your downtown are the parking requirements. So allowing more small format housing for boomers and millennials to be able to walk to support your businesses is a critical component of success for your place. That gets back to both land use for allowing more flexible uses, but also the parking requirements for those uses, because that's the easiest way to make it impossible to build like, a 4-pack of townhomes in a small lot if you got to have 2 parking spaces per unit. Like the geometry will never work. So that is a both and. You want thriving businesses, humans got to be living close by. Like
right. It's kind of surprising. I mean, one thing you realize, I learned this also looking kind of through Sarah Bonin's zoning atlas, right? Like, is how many places just you don't have legal housing ability. So you might have a whole district that has no parking requirements for any use, but the allowed use is no housing in that area. And if you could add housing as a use back in there with no parking requirements, then you really might see some adaptive reuse or some stuff built on top of these
and so
places.
even to take that a step further, then I'll stop monopolizing time, let Alli chime in, is that what we see is cities are often like, well, let's get those upper stories to residential. That'll be great and vibrant and walkable. And that's true, but the most expensive housing to produce is converting upper floor, commercial to residential. The code requirements, the sprinkler requirements, the building upgrades are really, really expensive, right? Allowing simple IRC, residential code, duplexes, cottages, stuff like that, that's way more cost effective to build on the land directly around your downtown. It can be small format, it can be dense, but that's a lot simpler to build. That's also able to be built by conventional single family builders, more or less, as opposed to sophisticated commercial builders that you often need for the commercial adaptive reuse, right? So that gets back to your point, Tony. It's not just allowing residential in your downtown, your core area, but like that 5 or 6 blocks around it, right? That is that in between zone of very full on neighborhood fabric and the commercial zone.
And I think this is also where I hope you guys are hearing that this solving parking is not the only thing you have to do to solve your downtown. There is a suite of other reforms that are needed, but parking is really the prerequisite. Making all of the other changes to your codes is meaningless if you haven't solved parking, but solving parking won't solve the whole problem. And so it really is, it is a first step that has to be taken, and it has to be taken as part of a suite of other changes to see positive impacts.
Yeah. And just keep going, Alli. Sorry.
I think one of the other examples that I want to use too of there is a city that we've worked in recently that is in kind of one of our surrounding states. I won't call them out by name, but they've got a downtown parking district requirement. So they went in, I don't know, 10 years ago and tore down a whole block of historic buildings in downtown to make a surface parking lot to serve the other downtown businesses. The downtown businesses still don't have a technical parking requirement, but to get a business license every year, each business needs to apply to use the parking in that shared parking district. And so they've created this administrative step that it might appear as though there's no parking requirement for those businesses. And the city has gone so far as to eliminate historic tax-paying buildings to provide free parking. And they make them annually apply to use it. And so we also see towns where it's a policy complexity, right? That you've got to dig into where is the friction point that we're causing, and how are we freeing up some of our city staff time by eliminating all these variances that we give people anyway, but we still have to walk through the process by reducing the amount of effort that small businesses in these buildings are needing to do, sometimes annually or on some, multi-year stage. How do we reduce some of what shows up as policy and preference by a city that may not even show up in the UDC? Because I think as anybody who's worked in parking also knows, it's not as simple as just the chart. Yes, the chart is silly. Yes, we can pretend the chart is real and adjust one of the stages in method. But we're sort of silly games to get to the eventual outcomes that we need. But this is also about friction reduction to build out more sustainable places.
Yeah, I would say, Alli, too, just the thought of being a business and not knowing year to year if you're going to get approved for parking spaces. How do you invest in tenant improvements? How do you invest in a building? Like, you're at risk to political whims. I mean, it's brutal, right? For the tenants to know, are they going to be okay or not?
Yeah. So one question I had, one more question here. I was thinking when you were talking are there there's cities. I mean, actually, Katie Gould, Sightline, just wrote that article about small towns versus big towns, and small towns actually, 2 to 1. I mean, partly it's just there's so many more small towns, but there is a lot of traction for parking reform in small towns. In parking reform of like what we're tracking mostly of getting rid of all your mandates citywide for all your uses. Is there a cultural or a city government type split that you've noticed in cities that are, like what makes the difference in a place where they're going to go for the methadone or the cold turkey, in your opinion? Like what are the characteristics where if an activist, like what are they going to push for? How do you know what you're ready for?
Yeah, I think Alli hit it on the beginning. Like, it's a question of like how much political courage exists in your place, right? And how much hunger for change and investment in a community exists, right? And so sometimes you've got a strong mayor that gets it and is ready to go and can lead a town forward. Like, ride and get as much done as you can with that horse, right? Do all you can. Sometimes mayors are, chicken, waffly, and you got a couple strong council people, right? So I think it's just a question of how much courage exists, how many people you're lucked in to get to courage. But what this is a John Anderson thing, is like, there's the brave, bold, right thing to do, and then there's a timid half step. And we are not going to say that methadone is not the timid half step. But what we also want to point out is that it shouldn't be 0 or 100, right? Like in our choices. And so sometimes, that timid half step, you're moving forward, and we want to have a path for a couple council people that want to do some stuff, but they don't have full support of the rest of political leadership, right? It's how do you calibrate to courage, I think, is really what we're trying to help figure out.
That's a good point. I mean, I also think like maybe velocity as a factor here, right? Like if
Yeah.
you're going to take, it's one thing to take 6 months or a year and get something out the door and keep working on the next thing. And it's another thing to plan for 3 or 4 years and then do something that's like, oh, we're reducing parking mandates on a streetcar corridor. It's like, okay, well, why'd you spend 3 years doing that? If you can move on something, it's worth moving on it because then you get another bite at the apple before
Yeah,
it's
I
too
want
late.
to share the story of Tim Keen in Atlanta because I think it's really helpful. You know, Tim, when he was here for a few years, came in early and said, "Wow, our zoning's so broken. Let's do a diagnostic." So they paid for a diagnostic of the entire zoning ordinance of Atlanta and said, "Here is a 40-page document with all the problems." And then what they said is, "There's so many problems, it's going to take 7 or 8 years, and we're like 10 years in to fix the zoning. Let's prioritize and let's find the quick fixes. Let's find the little lifts that we could do and start with that." And so they got through in a couple rounds of quick fixes, more parking reform and other substantial reforms than a lot of cities do in a whole overhaul. And we really don't have anything that significant in our 10-year overhaul beyond those quick fixes, honestly. And so when you say quick fix, obvious little stuff, you're de-escalating the temperature on what you're trying to do, right? Trying to change an entire ordinance of development regulations for a city really sounds scary to a lot of people. Fixing some silly little stuff, you can start to show and demonstrate. But I think the other thing, Allie, I mean, just I want you to talk the Fayetteville, the expectation that quarterly or yearly there is stuff to fix in your ordinance, that like training, that's huge, right? Like you don't have to be experts, but like if you get a city manager who's like, okay, like every 6 months, bring me your list of stuff that's bad that we could chip away at. Just that perspective is huge, right? Whether it's parking or anything else in your zoning, it just because like it'll cost you $250,000, 300, 400, $500,000 to hire consultants to redo the whole ordinance for a big city, right? That's a huge financial lift. Paying $5,000 or $6,000 for a parking module, right? And then like another module, like a bite at the apple, like that's the scale that this needs to be to work at. That's how we're calibrating our prices. Like it needs to be these quick hits to build the velocity.
One of the things that I think is really critical too with that kind of culture of change is that you are starting to build a mindset locally that your ordinance is not like handed down by Moses. That this is all junk that was passed from model codes in the 70s, and you as a town are in charge of it. And so I do agree that there is this risk with an incremental approach that at some point your commission changes over, people lose steam, you stop making changes, and it becomes sort of like half fixed, which is not ideal. That is not what we want. We want the plan of getting all the way there in terms of your general zoning code reform, your general UDC reform, not just parking reform. But the reality is your city is building out right now. There are projects that are being designed to your current standards right now that will be built and be in your city for the next 100 years. And so part of this too is any harm reduction that you can do by improving codes, even in a halfway way, right now impacts projects that are happening right now. Fixing things somewhat as you go is fixing projects that are getting put on the ground. Waiting 10 years until your consultant that you've paid $2 million gets your zoning code completely reformed and fixed, you get 10 years of work that is worse. And you have 10 years of units that weren't open for people to live in. Part of this background too is, you know, we talk so much about real estate development and about buildings and about streets, right? That physical realm is really what Eric and I work in. And so it's what we talk about a lot. I always try to bring it back though to what we're creating with cities, what we're creating with these physical places is the background of people's lives, right? It is the place that you are living, that you get to walk your kid to school or not. And they are out of school by the time you maybe have gotten your full zoning code fixed. And then it's a couple of years after your zoning code is fully passed that you're starting to get good projects out of it because they're having to start at design when that gets passed. So one of the things we always try to reinforce too is impact people's lives positively today in the way that you can and build towards that culture of eventual improvement in all of these different realms. You're also building that muscle for people to be able to spot what the zoning code problems and the policy problems are and feel like they have a pathway to change. And so incremental change is not really successful if you're just saying, okay, we're just making these couple of tweaks and it's then we're done. We've been successful. we really want you to encourage thinking about your zoning code changes and your parking changes as part of this larger whole that is focused on building better places for people.
So I saw Francis just put a great question in the chat about trying to change your zoning park requirements from required to recommended. And I know that's the big conversation around Norman. And I actually, that sounds positive, but I actually have a lot of angst around that. And the story that I'll tell was actually from CNU in Dallas, with Andres Dwani was talking about his first experiences in England. They were helping with DPZ was doing some planning over there. And he was really excited because there were no requirements, or just recommendations, and the town planner controlled the recommendations. So they were like, oh, this is wonderful. What they realized is recommended means whatever the town planner wants it to be, right? It's really hard to have a definitive answer when it's only recommended, right? Because you could come in with the prior required amount of parking and the planning director could decide that's still not good enough, right? Because they control all the cards for what should happen. And because there's nothing quantitative to achieve, they have all kinds of grounds to kill your project. So I am very concerned about the approach of switching required to recommended. That could be a very useful tool if you have a pioneering, head of planning willing to take the heat to make changes. They often don't last long in cities and are fired and replaced, and usually with a more conservative planning director. So how effective that is completely dependent on the person. Scares the hell out of me.
Yeah, I mean, I want to thank you. And so one thing is we're going to have Daniel's going to kind of paraphrase this other question from Dallas in a second. And I just want to point, we did in our Slack have a discussion around this, the require versus recommendation. I think a lot of our members share that same concern. We've thought about maybe former requirement might be something, or historic requirement. If you are going to go this way, indicate that this is just the number that used to be there, but like trying to not really give it authorization or give it any sort of authority, right? I mean, I know there's a lot of reasons people don't want to get rid of these tables because stuff depends on them elsewhere in the code, right? And so there's an anxiety about removing a number that might determine something else, So I think there is some concern around that. Daniel, do you want to pop in?
Yeah. We had a question earlier from Sarah May in Dallas. There's a lot of specificity to this question. I'm going to do my best to kind of paraphrase, and in a way that might be applicable to more communities. But the question refers to, so on the one hand, there's a number of areas that are planned development districts. So you've got this, as I understand it, kind of the patchwork you see in a lot of cities of custom, really convoluted kind of custom zoning for areas that arose as planned districts over time, a lot of complication. In some of these cases, prohibitions against further parking reductions in these places. So how do you deal with unwinding that?
That's a great
areas
question.
that are locked into bad policies in that way.
Well, so we had a great conversation with a city in the region. I won't name them, but they called us to talk about what are they like. We have all these PUDs and they're all onerous and hard to administer. They're all specialized. Like, how do we make our PUD process better? And I was like, well, you realize you have a lot of PUDs because you have no base zoning that will work for anything. And this is the planning director, and the light bulb went off. I'm like, you have no districts to allow anything rational to happen in your city. So everybody's plans to do a PUD because there's no other path. And you're stuck as a city with just nothing but PUDs trying to maintain files of conditions, of site plans, of legal agreements, of benefit agreements. Like, that is a reflection of dysfunctional zoning, right? Like, that's the problem. And that's a hard thing to fix, right? One of the things that we have, again, this is methadone, is, we're calling it a traditional neighborhood district in most places, where it's either a really good floating zone that allows really flexible infill housing around your downtown, or it can be a PUD, but the goal is it's a PUD mostly fleshed out, right? You don't have to write all of the conditions, and you have a sister architectural form controls, so you can have standardized guardrails for the stuff. It's allowable. Here's the controls for the buildings. You've got to work out a plat plan and go from there. It's still horrible, right? PUDs suck on the best of days. If you don't want PUDs, get some core zoning districts that allow things to happen, right? Like, there's no other way around it.
Yeah, PUDs are that's a great way of putting it. They're the hack around that more base level dysfunction.
I will say that we also talked this about 2 years ago. We talked to another city that was really excited because they just got PUDs for the first time in their city. So they went from having no functional zoning to PUD as their way to start solving problems. And you know, again, it's like, what are the proper steps in the process to getting clean? Like, that's kind of the core of this discussion. Like, it's hard. You know, how much courage does your place have?
I wanted to kind of tug on one other thread here, which I think is a thread that, you know, through a few of the questions that have been posed already, which is in terms of, you know, not just the logistics of making these incremental code changes, but the politics of doing it. You know, we've had some discussions internally of the danger of like, do you further legitimize a bad practice or a bad approach to this problem by doing the methadone step? Because when you're pitching that politically, you're not calling it methadone. If you're in a community that's going to be receptive to the idea that this is methadone, then they're probably already receptive to cold turkey. Like you got people who accept that we shouldn't have parking mandates, they're bad. So an example would be like, I mean, there's been some success at the state level in a number of states with legislation that targets specifically parking mandates near transit. You've seen that in cities too. And like I get a certain amount of queasiness about that because like it's an incremental step, but the politics around it involve actively legitimizing the idea that parking reform is something that applies where you have really, really A+ transit and it's not relevant for anybody else. That maybe we actively shouldn't do it anywhere else. And like you've actually sort of legitimized that argument by selling the policy on those grounds. I'm curious your response to that dilemma.
Ooh, so one is that's why we want to offer a smorgasbord of approaches. And one I forgot to say is, you know, Dallas, I've been told many times that if you provide extra bike parking, you can reduce car parking. But it's like, promote the goods, right? Tax the bads, you know, promote bike parking, promote saving historic buildings. And I think the thing is, when you talk about 4 or 5 policy approaches as a basket, you're diffusing the binary that you're talking about, Daniel, of transit or not transit. And the other thing is like tying to benefits. You know, I think the thing we see is zoning change is scary for folks, but reinvigorating old buildings is like the least scary thing you can do, right? You're not talking about changing the form or mass. You're like, just get a good user in the building that's been vacant for 5 years, right? And parking reform is one of the easiest ways to do that. So calibrating parking reductions to older buildings, that's a way to say, like, you know, neighborhood fabric matters. We shouldn't penalize these things that were built before parking was required. So it's also not a binary, and how you message really matters, right? How you talk about it, so that you don't create this false equivalent that, oh yeah, if you're not by transit, you need all the parking you can get. So there's definitely nuance to the sales pitch of this. Cool.
We've got some conversation too. We threw out some numbers earlier about what it costs for full zoning code rewrites that got a little bit of pushback. And I want to give a little bit of context to that, in that we have seen generally cities in the 50 to 250,000 person size, right? That sort of smallish city. You've got a full planning department, right? You comprehensive city staff, spending what we've seen from public budget approvals is 250,000 to 650 for full zoning code rewrites. That includes a lot of public meetings. I would guess that about half of those budgets are public meetings, public, you know, meeting with the city, the politics of getting it passed. And that in a lot of situations where you have cities that are spending around 250 to 3, they're getting eaten alive by their steering committees. And so you can, you know, the big names that are doing this, that are getting it pretty successfully passed, is more in that $400,000 to $600,000 range. Big cities like Atlanta and Austin are spending in the millions. I think Austin's latest, if you go through all the budget allocations that they have done to their zoning code rewrite in the last 10 years, they've spent almost $6 million at my last count. And so there are some of these big cities that, like, we are casually throwing out, it's really expensive to do a full from scratch zoning code rewrite in a lot of places. And I want to say really loudly too, a lot of that zoning code reform is the politics of getting it passed, and the city like meetings and the public meetings and the public engagement. That section tends to be, from what we've seen in terms of budget allocations that are published by cities, one of the biggest chunks of that funding. And so two, building a culture of a town that is receptive to zoning code reforms, that sees the need for it, that really is supportive and is just there to hash out the details of how it gets done, you can cut your eventual cost to do the full solution very significantly. And so that's one of the incremental things that I think is most sustainable for a lot of towns, is start to build out the education, start to build out that culture and comfort with big zoning code rewrites, and you can cut the budgets significantly down. I bet Austin has spent the vast majority of the budget that they have on education, public meetings, and trying to convince people it's important, not on the actual rewriting the words of their zoning code. And so two, this incremental approach does build towards supporting a much more affordable, much more attainable rewrite of a zoning code later, that is, you know, really ready to bring in. And so, you know, the ADU ordinance, I think that's one of our modules, is like $5,000. Right? You're not hiring a custom consultant to say, we need to fix just this part of the code. We need low cost solutions to get to the eventual bigger cost. And that bigger cost can get brought down by taking some of these incremental steps, as long as you've got a plan to not get stuck halfway.
Yeah, a good example too from Atlanta around ADUs was, we helped get the first ADU ordinance passed, but what we did was, the ordinance wasn't that hard. It was, where do we do it? And we have a 2-family district that had a lot of development and change going on, and it wasn't that big, and it was happening in neighborhoods used to development. I was like, this one district is the first district to add ADUs to. It is the perfect pilot. We can come back in year 2 or 3 after we piloted there. So again, and that's exactly what happened, and we're able to get it to 3 or 4 more districts after that. But how do you take the first step, right? And I'm very big on 1929 before development pattern imposed. Trying to put ADUs in a suburban development pattern feels really scary to a lot of residents. They need to see it first and then maybe covet it and want it to bring to their place. Trying to lay it out to the entire city, it can be really hard, right? And maybe, to Tony's point earlier, it could take 5 or 6, 7 years to come to peace with an ADU ordinance for your entire town. Or, you know, there's like 2 districts that are willing to take it tomorrow. Let's start there and get it going.
Great. Well, we are past an hour. So, you know, and I think it was just 45-minute schedule, but it was, you know, obviously folks stuck around. And it was pretty good. I do want to thank everyone for coming. Paula, did you have additional closing remarks here, or do you want to come back
I'm
on?
just going to share the feedback form. We have a feedback form, so please, thank you for staying longer, folks.
And
It
thank
has
you,
been a really-
Eric and Alli, very much.
Yeah.
You know.
Thank you for having
Yeah.
us.
Thank you so much. It has been a very insightful event, so really, really thank you.